Let's talk a bit about the Black Voter Project. For folks who are learning about this institution for the first time, what does this organization do and why?
So the Black Voter Project is kind of a side project that I've had for about 6, 7 years now. I started in 2016 when I first came straight out of grad school. It started as a response to a lack of data on the Black community and studying Black politics, especially during the Obama era. It was just really frustrating and saddening to have data really from the 80s and 90s that I had to rely upon when looking at public opinion polls and data to use for research projects. And so I wanted to
Mm.
try and collect some of my own data. And so in 2017, I ran a pilot study that turned into a series of national and statewide public opinion polls that are Black specific. So for 99% of my polling projects, I only collect data on the Black community. And that allows me to do so in a very methodologically sound and nuanced way where I'm taking into consideration the special needs of sampling the Black community, meaning I'm making sure that there's a large enough sample to talk about subgroups, to talk about differences between men and women, differences based on age, education. I'm also making sure that I have an instrument that is culturally sensitive, that asks
Wow.
questions in a way that takes into consideration how the Black community might feel about issues differently than the general population. And then things such as question ordering, the way that we're sampling, the way that we're collecting data, and then the analysis of the data is centered in a theoretical historical framework on what the Black community has been through and how politics within the Black community, really Black politics, is different from how we must understand American politics as a whole because of the history of oppression, the history of discrimination, and the legacy of slavery that really dictates how much of the Black community views American political systems and institutions.
Come through with the information. Data is what we need. And for a lot of people, getting access to the data starts with the question that includes, like, well, what kind of data? So when you were looking back in 2016 or 2013 during the Obama administration and trying to figure things out, you referenced that you had to go back to data sets from the 80s and the 90s. What is the type of data that someone like you needs in order to make sense of where the Black electorate is on any given issue?
I think the first and foremost, you need a data set that is large enough to actually say something within a statistical margin of error that makes sense. And so anytime you're trying to extrapolate a data set to a large population, say hundreds of thousands of people, you want to have a minimum of like 800 to 1200 responses. Anything less than that, and you're talking about a margin of error around any type of conclusions you draw from that data that's so large that it doesn't really make sense to try and say anything, right? If you're looking at, okay, we see 50% of people say this, but it could be 10 percentage points one way or 10 percentage points the other way. You're talking about now a 20 percentage point swing in either direction. What are you really saying, right? What type of
Mm.
confident conclusion are you really drawing? So in order to get that margin of error down to around 2 to 3 percentage points, which is what you see on most national public opinion polls, you need to have 800 to 1200 responses minimum. And that's just to start to make conclusions from the data. Once you actually want to look at, okay, let's do some comparisons within the data. Let's look at how different groups within the Black community look at different things, behave, participate in politics. Let's look at how maybe various identities within the Black community. The Black community is not a monolith. There are different ideological perspectives. There are different ways of approaching political behavior and participating in politics. The Black community, right? You have rural and urban populations within the Black community, right? To actually look at those differences, again, you need to have a significantly large sample from the start. And so I think first and foremost, that was one of the biggest thrusts with the Black Voter Project was to make sure that whenever I collected data, I did everything I could to have at least 1,000 people, if not more, in the data set.
Hmm. There are a lot of questions around what's motivating Black voters, and I, in addition to doing this work here on this show, I run a law center based at Medgar Evers College in Brooklyn, and we are a voting outreach education entity in large and in many ways. And that's not all that we do, but that's a significant portion of it. And one of the questions or types of questions that we often come up against is why X portion of the Black community is not voting. We actually have a caller on the line right now. Let's take this call. This is Will out of New York. Will is a first-time caller, and Will has a comment on why Black men are not voting. And I'd like us to hear this comment and then see if you, Dr. Towler, can give us some data-driven information that might support what it is that we're seeing here. Will, welcome to the Call-In family, first-time caller.
Oh, yes. Thank you. Occasionally, I do listen to your program. I'm so glad that the brother that's speaking on now, speaking on similar issues that I would like. I'm over 70, and I might have been polled in my lifetime maybe a couple of times, and I'm very active in the community that I live in. I live in a community, by the fact, in New York State, the third most poorest, I think in the fourth most segregated, city, in New York State. And what we see as Black men here and the ones I talk to, we also do a Black study group, on Monday nights in the cities I live in. I'm very aware of a lot of things that go on across the country. For instance, you spoke on Africa. Africa's kicking a lot of Europeans up out of them countries.
Mr. Will, just for time's sake, we got a lot of calls on it, and I want to get to the main point that you want to make, because I want to tie it back to what Dr. Towler is here to discuss. If you could give us your perspective, because you told the call screener that you had some thoughts on why Black men are not voting. If you could give us that thought, and then we can have Dr. Towler respond and see what the data is telling us about that.
I sure will. There's three things. Number one, when we look, for instance, in the city I stay in, we see immigrants come to the city and they buy up all the stores. Then 3 months later, come in the newspaper, we've been redlining Black folks. Black men are mad what they see about that. Then they would say, we don't want the stores. And number two, I see them talk more about, you understand what I'm saying, the LGBT community, and they do about Black issues as far as like criminal justice, when it's not just guns in our community, it's the state of mind in our community. We see them talk about that.
Okay. So, Mr. Will, just for time's sake, we're going to give us your third one, and then we'll conclude there. Go right ahead. What's your third one?
Yeah. No, deal with them two then. That's enough.
Okay, thank you, sir. We appreciate that. Dr. Towler, we do hear that from a variety of callers, that there are some concerns about whether or not Black men are going to vote. And we see a whole lot of prognostication, a whole lot of tea leaf reading out in the general public. What does your data of Black people, about Black people, tell you about the Black male electorate in this current environment?
The data speaks loudly to this, and I think there's a real concern that Black men in particular are less enthusiastic, are apathetic, and even disillusioned when it comes to politics. But I just want to make sure that I'm saying, yes, that's apparent for Black men, but that's also a general statement for the Black community as a whole right now when looking at politics, and especially the Democratic Party. And it's been very difficult for the Black community to find something to enthusiastically grab onto since Obama left office. There's been very little in politics since sort of this historic moment with the first Black president for the Black community to say, yes, that's something that we can get behind. That's something that we want to support, that we enthusiastically agree with. The Biden administration has left a lot of things on the table. We've seen voting rights sort of come to a halt. We saw the George Floyd Policing Act grind to a standstill as well in Congress. Those were two of the largest policy initiatives that were centered on issues really important to the Black community, specifically with the George Floyd Policing Act, right? Issues that are front and center for Black men. And so it's no surprise that Black men in particular are not finding much to look forward to in politics today. That said, there's also a number of campaigns set forth to continue to highlight the differences between the parties in ways that tear us apart rather than build us up and bring us together. And I think there's a lot of misinformation and propaganda campaigns out there, especially around immigration and around how immigration affects the Black community, that causes individuals, and particularly Black men, to be able to point the finger somewhere for what's going on in the country rather than not having anywhere to look for answers. And so we've run, in addition to the large public opinion polls, we do a lot of focus group work where we'll sit down with about 6 to 7, 8 people, and we'll actually talk to people and we'll ask them, why are they interested in politics, or why are they not interested in politics, and what issues are problems to them. And the issue of immigration continues to come up, but it also comes up from a standpoint where people in these focus groups are just regurgitating some of the conservative talking points that immigrants are coming and taking jobs, that immigrants are draining the economy, when there's no actual data or evidence to support that this is what's happening in these local economies and in these state economies, right? And so
Wow.
the immigration issue, at least on surface level, is more of sort of a catch-all to point the finger at someone for how things are going,
Mm.
especially when it comes to Black men, rather than an actual a legitimate complaint based on data and evidence. However, this look at sort of prioritizing LGBTQ issues within the Democratic Party, right? This seems to be a legitimate complaint because, as I mentioned, there have been issues regarding the Black community, issues focused more on race and racial identity, such as voting rights, right? Something that has a legacy of discrimination within the Black community, such as police violence, that the Democratic Party has not been able to accomplish anything on, right? That has
Right.
stalled out on. And so they're absolutely within the Black community, and the data supports this, right? Is some animosity towards the Democratic Party's inability to get things done on these top two issues when there's seemingly movement in other places.
So what are we to do with that reality? Like the Voting Rights Act, which is something I live in New York. So as a New York voter, as someone who works there, I'm very grateful that we have the New York State Voting Rights Act, something that our law center fought very hard for, along with so many others. Shout out to Perry, shout out to Eljoy, and all the folks who were doing that work. But we also saw with the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, these were two pieces of legislation that had 48 out of 50 Democrats in support, two Democrats against, Joe Manchin, Kristen Sinema, along with all of the Republicans. The reality is that there are not the numbers in government for these pieces of legislation to have been passed. You got to have the 60 votes in the Senate. They're barely 50. Americans are only giving Joe Biden a zero margin of Congress to work with. And so there's no way for the Democrats to legislatively get the Voting Rights Act or the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act enacted without those 60 votes in the Senate. It both passed in the House. How do we take that political reality, the limitations on that, and explain it to our community in a way that, one, ain't going to get you hit with well, you're just shilling for the Democratic Party. But as when you're trying to explain, so this is how the things work. But I'm old enough to know once I got to explain how things work and use a chart and a graph and numbers, I've already lost, sir. I've already lost that battle. How do we take the political realities in a way that can allow us to explain to our community what these things are, how they happen, so that we don't just say, well, the Democrats they couldn't pass this, they couldn't pass that. Well, of course they couldn't. They don't have the numbers. How do we make sense of the data in that way that would allow us to have a conversation that can move us forward, as opposed to sitting in the space where we're pointing fingers and ultimately staying home and not voting at all?
That's a great question. And I think, that's the $1 million question in Black politics right now. What the data suggests, what we've suggested in our research, when looking at the data, is that there's not much room to make a policy argument when it comes to understanding or motivating the Black community right now. We have to really put politics today within historical perspective, and in many ways meet Black people where they are, which is at a place that is less optimistic and less positive about politics and the future of American politics than we were 8 to 10 years ago during the Obama administration. And so we argue, and the data suggests that trying to encourage people to participate in politics, to engage in politics based on getting something done policy wise, is a very hard sell for many
Wow.
of the reasons that you mentioned. However,
Yeah.
it's almost more important to get involved right now because the policy progress that we've made over the last 50, 60 years, the last two generations of progress, can be wiped away far more quicker, far more rapidly than anything that we can gain. And so when trying to make arguments about why we should still engage in politics, why we should still participate in politics, we have to live within the current political context, which is that we had this moment. We had this historical moment where we broke this barrier, this ceiling around white men in the White House. What that has done, though, is that has put us in a very sort of turbulent time following those 8 years of Obama, where the country is almost at a standstill saying, we did that. We don't want to do anything else. It's going to be very difficult to continue to push for progress right now. And we kind of just have to hold the line. We have to continue to get out there to participate, to save a lot of the progress we've made over the last 50 to 60 years until we can reach that next moment, right? Until we can get back to another moment where significant change can happen. And when we look at American history and politics, that's sort of what has happened for the last couple hundred years in this country, right? We have a long period where we prioritize a sort of smaller government. We prioritize states' rights, a focus on the individual, on individualism. And then we have short periods of almost momentous change, historical change. We have a Reconstruction period following the Civil War. We have a New Deal period following the Great Depression. We have a civil rights movement period following years of like a global movement of civil rights. And then we have this Obama movement following 50, 60 years of increased voting rights, expanded voting rights following the Voting Rights Act. And so we have to sort of, again, hold the line until we get to that next historical moment when we can actually see momentous change. It's not all going to happen at once because it's never happened at once.
You know, this is one of the reasons why I really believe, like, in the work that we do, I tell my team, our interns, what we ain't going to do is lie to black people. What we ain't going to do is sell you, oh, if you vote, your ancestors will be proud. Oh, if you vote. And like, nah, we ain't going to get Wakanda coming out that voting booth, and it's going to look exactly the way it look right now for some time. We go into the voting booth because we know that the people who come out of these elections as the winners are going to decide who gets the resources, the schools, the houses, the buses, the trains, the subways, the things, the grocery stores, the libraries, the people who win the election, whether you voting or not, honey. Those are the people who are going to get to decide all the decisions that impact our society. And we have very honest conversations. When we talk about the census, we like, listen, we know black people don't want to fill out no census. First time some strange white folks started coming to the door asking you how many people was inside your village that night, you was in the bottom of a slave ship. We get it. We understand it. You might be on a plantation. Somebody come knocking at your door trying to find out who inside. Half your family might be sold the next day, or you might lose access to social services in the early 1900s, or you might be Breonna Taylor and not live to see the next day. So we get it, and we always have a very frank, honest, we know there's some BS kind of approach to get out the vote. And here's why we need you to vote anyway. Not because it's going to be Wakanda forever when we come out of there, but because you are going to create an environment that makes it easier for us to fight the next day. Let's get another caller on the line. We've got somebody out of Maryland, Yvette, who wants to push back a little bit on some of this conversation. Yvette's also a first-time caller, so let's give her the call. Yvette, you're on the air with Lurie Daniel Favor Show and Dr. Towler. What would you like to say this morning?
So I guess I'm just a little frustrated, and perhaps I live and breathe politics. I'm not a politician. I'm just an average citizen who stays engaged in my community. And this is so disheartening when I hear your guests say that, well, you know, black people are disgusted because of the George Floyd the George Floyd Act, the Voting Rights Act. When do we start holding Republicans accountable? When is the conversation going to be about what are the Republicans doing? I am so tired of hearing, well, the Democrats aren't doing, but there's another party over there who is absolutely not doing anything. And how then do we engage? What you just said, I just heard you say, Lurie, gave me a little more hope. But it's very depressing to think that our community is this lost when it comes to understanding civic engagement, politics, how it all works. And if you don't stay engaged, you are going to die, literally, because the people who are making all we have to do is look at what's happening in the predominant, there are so many African Americans, and they run in red states, and look at how that's benefiting us. So I don't know. I'm just really disgusted, but I would like to hear the conversation about why is it that every time we talk about what the Democrats aren't doing, a lot of it is because of what the Republicans refuse to do. And we keep thinking that carrying that same water that, let's change parties. The Republicans will do a better job because I did better under Donald Trump because of the stimmies. And not understanding where the stimulus checks actually came from. Oh, my God.
So, Yvette, Take a breath. Take a breath. It's gonna be all right, sis. We're gonna figure this out together. We are. I promise you that we are. But the answer, I think, to your question is also in the question that you posed. You live and breathe this stuff. You and I, like, I could imagine we would probably, if we were to go have some tea or some coffee or something a little more stiff, depending on the day of the week and the time of day, we would probably have robust conversation about the intricacies and the nuances of the political reality that we're facing. I think, Dr. Towler, the challenge is the vast majority of our community is not doing that. And the vast majority of Americans are not doing that. But we also have, as Black people, from 1619 to 1964, with just that brief little teeny tiny period of Reconstruction where we could not even have this conversation without having our lives in danger. So we know the least of many groups coming into what civic engagement looks like. What are your thoughts on the frustrations that our caller just shared?
Those are very legitimate concerns, important frustrations, but let's be clear, right? We are seeing a very vibrant political time with the Black community. We've seen the highest Black turnout in American history in the last 10 years, the last couple of decades, right? In 2020, Black turnout was at 62, 63%, right there with every other group. So it's not like Black folk as a whole are not turning out or are participating less than other groups, right? It's that the margins, especially in some of these swing states that Democrats need to maintain the White House, some of these close congressional elections, places like Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Georgia, the margins are so thin that getting just that 0.5% additional voter turnout makes a difference. And so one thing that we've been able to do, again, collecting unique data, is to separate voters into high propensity and low propensity voters. And I'd imagine both you and I and the caller would fall into that high propensity category. And we are the ones who are exercising our right to vote and making our voices heard. But we need to get more of those low propensity voters to the polls. We saw a significant amount more turnout for Obama to mark that historical moment in 2008 and 2012, but we need to continue to get those people to vote following the Obama era, right? In these periods, because that's what changed the tide. That's what turned the political map towards Democrats, allowed for a sort of more hopeful vision of progress for the future. What we found in the data, though, is that the best way right now to do that is to do exactly what the caller suggested, highlight how dangerous the Republican Party, Trump, and the MAGA movement are to the Black community right now. And that really focusing in not just on sort of the dangers in a broad sense, dangers to democracy, but focusing in on the dangers, the racial threat that Trump and the GOP represent to the Black community is what's going to make the difference in this political era, in this context, in political environment. And that's what we recommend. That's what all our research points to, is that the most effective way to get Black folk to participate, especially those low propensity Black voters, is to highlight how dangerous of a threat the GOP is to the Black community right now, and how we think voting rights are being rolled back now. Just wait. If we get another Trump administration, voting rights are going to be unrecognizable, right? Same thing goes for police funding. Same thing goes for sort of our rights and freedoms around going across borders when it comes to immigration, right? You want to have border patrol at every state border. That's a possibility, right? If we have another conservative Trump administration, and that's going to affect Black and brown people disproportionately. And so highlighting those things, identifying some of the issues within the court right now and how dangerous and even more conservative court could be for future generations can be really, really effective, right? And far more effective than trying to talk about failures of the Democrats.
I like that, because that's one thing I can definitely do. I can see a danger sign, and I can definitely highlight that. And that feels like it reflects what we have been experiencing on the ground. We're going to be rolling out this fall a series of community conversations, fall going into spring, at the center, at the Law Center. And part of those conversations are really thinking about how major issues, Black people and the ballot, are all connected, because we realize that you're not going to be able to fill in that 340 some odd year gap between 1619 and 1964. You're not going to be able to fill in the gap of knowledge, the experiential knowledge that we were excluded from having overnight. And just in an election cycle, it's going to take conversation, it's going to take dialogue. But what we are seeing is that we had a young gentleman who came to our last conversation, and he was very much a miss, the Democrats and the Republicans are all the same. And we didn't get angry. Nobody was allowed to get angry, because this was a welcoming space. It was a loving space that was designed for this kind of conversation. But through the dialogue, that young man went from the Democrats and Republicans are two wings on the same bird to realizing okay, wait a minute. This is way more. I didn't know this. I didn't. How come nobody told me this were some of the things that they were saying? And when you talk with our people in a way that is not judgy, that values their experience and respects what they bring and their concerns that they bring, that doesn't say, well, you can't blame the Democrats for not getting the Voting Rights Act. When you don't do that, and when you speak in a way that communicates, one, I believe love, right? And love for community and willingness to work with community. And then you're able to talk about the very practical realities that we're facing. And you can explain it to people. They get it. We are many things. Dumb is not one of them. And when we can create enough environments where that can happen, I believe we can do more than we will be able to do more than just speak to the fears and highlight the concerns. We'll be able to have more of those nuanced, more sophisticated discussions, but we got to get there and we got to scaffold our way there. So I'm very encouraged that there are some indications that there is a way to do this effectively. And when it comes to highlighting the danger of the GOP to us as a people, is it that we're tapping into the sentiment of community, or are we tapping into a sense of collective preservation from harm? What is it that's activating the openness for Black voters, particularly Black men, when it comes to highlighting the dangers that our community faces if we're not civically engaged?
I think it's both. I think it has a lot to do with solidarity and understanding protection that is necessary for the Black community. Well, at the same time, though, the instances and examples of threat to the Black community are abound, right? These are easily identifiable. You can point out the white supremacist rallies that took place almost, months within Trump entering office in 2016. They're very clear and present. These dangers are not hidden. They're not complicated, right? There's not a complex political conversation you have to say. You can just point and say, look, we can see clearly under Trump, when Trump's in office, white supremacy is not hiding as much anymore. It's out, it's there, right? And it's there not just in society, but in politics and in the legislation and in the executive orders that are passed. And so there's very clear examples to point to, and that makes the argument stronger and resonate more for those low propensity voters who who don't pay attention to politics all the time, right? Who are not always involved in these intense political conversations. I will say this though, while voting is important, we've also learned that as a Black community, it's not going to be the only answer. And that we have to understand that anytime we've seen extremely momentous change, we've seen sort of institutional change within American politics towards an expansion of democracy, it's come on the back of a political social movement that involves participation in many ways beyond voting. And so we're going to have to also look at past movements and embrace the fact that voting alone is not going to be the answer. And we're going to have other methods out there. We're going to have to look towards boycotts, towards petitions, towards marching, right? And actually protesting and having our voice heard in a number of different ways beyond just voting. Although right now in an election year, voting seems to be, right, the come all be all of politics.
Yeah, I would add to that, enhance our understanding of mutual aid, cultivate the ability for community to provide for community when government does not, so that we not only solely relying on government, but we're also getting a sense of empowerment for ourselves as well. Dr. Towler, I've appreciated this conversation. Will you come back? I feel like we're going to need more connection with folks who are doing this sort of work as we continue to move forward. I hope we can get you to come back to the show to talk with us more about what the data is revealing, particularly as we're getting closer to November. But as someone who does this work, this is your focus. This is what you do. Just leave us with some insight into the best ways that we can make use of this information if we're trying to ensure that our community is more civically engaged going forward and not feeling as though they need to separate themselves away.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be happy to continue this conversation. We are currently fielding a public opinion survey right now. We fielded the first wave in April and May. And so those results are available on the blackvoterproject.com website. You can go in and look through top lines and crosstabs. And, I would encourage people to look for sources of data, such as the Black Voter Project, that are reliable and accurate when it comes to the Black community. And if you're going to look at data, public opinion data, pay attention to the number of people in the sample, look for samples that are significantly large and that have Black researchers, that have people studying Black politics, engaged in Black politics, running the survey. paying attention to the methodology and how the data is being collected. And so with that said, we are continuing to collect data. We're going to collect a second wave of the survey where we're actually talking to the same people, as many of the same people as we can from the first wave, to understand how attitudes change over time. And so we're going to be collecting that data in July and hopefully posting that data towards the end of July, early August, to again update the survey results from a couple months ago and continue to bring in quality, detailed data about the Black community as we approach this election.
I really appreciate you and the work that you all are doing at the Black Voter Project. I'm grateful that we're going to get you back on the show. You've given us a lot of good food for thought, and I may have to have my staff start pulling this data. We are going to be having a convening of Black college students in the fall, the state of the Black college student voter, and this is the very type of data that we need to make sure that we get in the hands of our people so that they understand how to move forward.